of this problem are really everywhere. There was a story the other day here in Washington, D.C. about a young child, about 12 years old, a lovely young boy in school here, who was coming home from church with his mother one day and was the victim of a random drive-by shooting in which he was killed. And virtually every night in cities across this country, the manifestations of violence and a deteriorating social order are there for everyone to see. And something has to be done about it. And there is a responsibility of our federal government to understand what's taking place in terms of the deprivation, the absence of jobs, the absence of medical care, the absence of adequate education and opportunity, the breakdown of family structure, the fact that our government itself has turned its attention away from problems here in America, particularly the problems in our urban centers over the last decade or so particularly. I rise today in two capacities to start this discussion. One is as chairman of the Senate Housing on Banking, the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, where we have a responsibility to try to respond as best we can to the urban needs of this country. And also I rise as chairman of the Democratic Task Force on Community and Urban Revitalization. Our group of senators, having been meeting now for some time and generating recommendations as to what might be done, forwarded those recommendations to the Majority Leader, George Mitchell, and he took those ideas and added others in conjunction with Speaker Foley and Majority Leader Gephardt, and wrote a letter to President Bush dated May 11th, 1992. I ask that that letter be made a part of the record at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair, in which the letter itself sets forth not only a desire to want to work together cooperatively with the executive branch to deal with the urgent problems of our urban centers, but also to lay out a series of urgent requirements, areas where attention has to be given, resources have to be focused, that there needs to be a major national strategy applied in this area with a number of component parts to that strategy which are laid out in this letter, some of which I will talk about just a little bit later. The reason this is most urgent is not just that we've seen the conditions manifesting themselves in Los Angeles, and it may well happen in any other American city at any time, but the fact that our government, our federal government, has been withdrawing support and help and attention from the cities certainly over the decade of the 1980s and now on into the 1990s. During that period of time, the focus of our government increasingly was outside America. It was to help other countries, other places. And in fact, today, in terms of economic strategy, the American government and the administration has an economic program for virtually every country in the world except our own. There's a plan for Mexico called the Free Trade Agreement with Mexico. There's a plan for Kuwait. There's a plan for Communist China called the Most Favored Nation Trading Status Strategy. There's a plan to help all of the parts of the old Soviet Union. There is virtually a plan for every other country in the world except our own. And during the 80s, help that normally would have gone to build our own society and help our own people was withdrawn. Let me just give you an example of some of the cuts during that period of time. Probably the most basic is job training and employment programs. We all know that people should work. If people don't have the skills to be able to slot into today's job market, they're not going to have jobs, they're not going to be able to live decent lives or support their families. During the 1980s, job training and employment programs were cut by the federal government 63%. Housing programs. You've got to be able to get on off the streets or get out of a homeless shelter if you're going to have any kind of semblance of family structure or order or a chance to live a productive life. Housing programs at the federal level during the 1980s were cut over 82%. Community development block grants. We're going to have hearings this afternoon in the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. We'll have a series of leading mayors from across the country coming in to testify. I fully expect that they will say, as they have before, that the deep cuts in the community development block grants have been very hurtful to the cities, have held back their abilities to rebuild themselves and to provide a better environment and more job opportunity. Community development block grants in the 80s cut about 40%. Community services block grants, this is to try to just get the basic services in place out in the communities. In the 80s, cut 45%. Social service block grants cut over 38%. That's not the worst of it. General revenue sharing, which was an effort to try to give communities that were in trouble and struggling some financial muscle to try to deal with their problems and to try to stimulate economic revitalization, job creation, attract businesses in and so forth. General revenue sharing was eliminated altogether, just eliminated completely, taken out. Cities no longer got that help. Urban development action grants to try to stimulate targeted major investment opportunities in cities that would bring jobs with them and job creation, that was eliminated. Health planning grants to try to figure out how we break this tide of very high, in fact, among the highest in the world, infant mortality rates and the death rates among youth in our inner city areas and so forth, to try to break that problem. Health planning grants eliminated altogether in the 1980s. So what happened was, during that period of time, America changed its focus. It turned its back on its own people here in the United States, put the focus overseas in terms of the needs of other countries. And that's where the attention has gone, where the strategy has gone. We've even gone over to fight wars, to restore the Emir of Kuwait, for example, to put him back on the throne over there. And yet we've been, at the same time, during that same decade, over the last 10 years or so, withdrawing our support and our help from our own people. Let me give you an example out of today's Washington Post. It's about as stunning as any that you could hope to see. We know in order to try to meet the problems of the inner cities today, it's going to take a massive application of resources, talent, money, focused investment, health programs, better education, better infrastructure, better crime control, better fight against drugs, all the things that it's going to take to really lift our cities up and to provide some ladders of opportunity so people have a chance to get ahead. Today in the Washington Post front page, it says among LA's biggest losses, jobs. It says thousands more out of work in city already reeling from recession. It talks about one man here, 34 years old, Danny Jackson, who lost his job. He was being paid $5.25 an hour as a janitor. Was working, the place where he worked was burned to the ground. He's lost that job, so he's out in the unemployment lines and can't find other work. He's desperate. There are millions like him across the country, not that have lost their jobs for the same reason, but who can't find jobs. And even in his case, with his job, doesn't say here whether he has a family or not. If he does, that is a below poverty wage, even the job that he did have before it was just lost. We need enough jobs to go around in America for all of our people. We need enough jobs. We need an aggressive job strategy for America. That will do more to solve all the other problems than any other single thing that we can do. But as you read through these articles, and you read through what the comments are coming back from the executive branch, they say there's no money. They say there's no resources. Oh, yes, there are a few dribs and drabs here and there, a little bit, scrape together a little bit of this, and put some clever phraseology on it, weed and seed, enterprise zones, and so forth and so on. If they're just words, just phrases, not backed up by major program muscle, it isn't going to mean anything. It might sort of help carry the debate down through the next few months and maybe pass the election, but it's not going to make any material difference in these communities unless these programs are substantial, are real, the country locks together, business, government, and citizens to make it all happen. But so far at least, when you look at the resource side of the equation as to whether there's going to be an effort to take and really put the muscle into it, no real sign of that. Now that's what's on page 1. This relates to what's going on here in America. How do we help our own? If you turn to page 11 of today's Washington Post, and I want to just do that right now because it really makes the point. Turn over to page 11. And you look down here at this one article. It's not very large in relationship to the articles on the front page. And here's what it says. It says, House panel approves 20 B-2 bombers. And then it says this is the third paragraph down, seeking assurances that $44.4 billion $44.4 billion will complete the program. The Armed Services Committee is asking Defense Secretary Cheney to meet with the committee before the House takes up the defense budget in June. Now, this is to buy 20 airplanes. These airplanes, these B-2s, by the way, we don't use them here in the United States. We got a war going on in our own cities, but this money isn't being spent to deal with the war in America. It's being spent on imaginary problems around the world, where the Berlin Wall's come down, the Soviet Union's fallen apart. Our biggest problem around the world today is economic competition from Japan and from Europe and from other countries. That's our main threat. And by the way, B-2 bombers don't do anything to help us combat that economic threat. But the cost of these planes has gone from $430 million a piece. Imagine an airplane that costs $430 million. That's a lot of airplane. But the price has gone up, 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 up. You know what it now costs to build one of these B-2 bombers? $2.3 billion. Now that for one plane. They want to build 20 more. $2.3 billion for one. Now, as I have added up what the administration has said it's willing to commit in the way of resources to deal with the urban crisis in America, it is less money than to build just one of these B-2 bombers. And yet they say they've got the money not just to build one more, but to build 20 more. Now, what are people across America going to say? I don't just mean the people in the inner cities who are living there with hopelessness and deprivation and no jobs and no health care and poor education and no prospects for their children. And they pick up this same paper and they read that there's no real help for them, but we can pour another $44 billion into 20 B-2 bombers against a non-existent threat to feed the military-industrial complex a few more tens of billions of dollars. What about all the rest of the human needs in this country? What about the senior citizens? What about the urban poor? What about the rural poor? And this isn't just a black issue or a minority issue. A lot of it is concentrated in the black and the Afro-American community and in the Latino community, but there are a vast number of poor whites and other people of other ethnic backgrounds that are caught in this same dilemma. They need help from their government. They need their government to care about them and to come down off cloud nine and to look at the real problems that are facing people every single day, where a mother or a father are afraid even to send their child out the front door of an inner city residence to go to the school because of the violence up and down the streets. And children are being gunned down one after the other. I'm talking about innocent victims of crime that has nothing to do with them. They just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. School children, elementary school age children, and it's happening every single day in cities across this country. And we are doing about this much to deal with it. Now, what are we doing to deal with this big problem of the need for the B-2 bombers? Well, we're doing this much for the B-2 bombers. We just found $44 billion for that. That's not pocket change. $44 billion is not pocket change. At a minimum, we ought to be prepared to spend, say, let's be conservative about it. Suppose we just spend 10% as much on rebuilding our cities and providing hope for inner city people as we spend on these 20 B-2 bombers. And you might look at that and think about it and say, well, let's see. If we did that, that'd be $4.4 billion. That would sure help. But why should we be squandering all of this money on things that really don't matter and that we don't need when we're turning our back on the things that do matter and that we do need? And we need civil order in this country. And that's not going to happen if our communities are falling apart and flying apart because of all of the deprivation. You deprive people of a decent way to live, and you're going to get chaos. And we're getting chaos. We're getting more and more the manifestations of a clockwork orange society. That doesn't have to be our future. Yesterday there was a story, however, in the New York Times, written by Johnny Apple, one of their noted reporters over many years. On page A18, I want to read you one paragraph. he was talking with some people around President Bush as to what to do about this problem, the urban problem, the problem of the violence, the problem of lack of jobs, and so forth and so on. Now listen to this paragraph, quotation. "What I want," said one of Mr. Bush's top strategists, "is a few more days of this. A simple, clear program with 3 or more points. Then get off it. The longer the president seems preoccupied with Los Angeles, the more he and his urban policies become the issue, and that's not good for us." End of quote. Now, what did this top strategist for President Bush mean by that? If you read the whole article, it means that what they want to do is come in, a few attractive sounding buzzwords, sort of make it look as if they're going to do something about the problem, maybe sprinkle a few dollars out here and there on the problem, and then basically push that problem off the stage and take the focus somewhere else. We're talking about the lives of American people. Our inner city youth are part of our country. They are America's children. They have to matter to us. And if they survive, they are part of our future. And as Rodney King himself said, we have to live together. We're here for a period of time together on this planet. We have to learn to live together. I think we can do better than that. I think we ought to care about each other, and we ought to learn to love each other. I think that's what we ought to do. And by the way, our founding documents are written around that concept about life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and a banding together for the good of all, not just for the good of some, not just for people at very high income levels or people who come with vast family fortunes. No, the founding documents are written exactly the other way, to try to envision a nation where everybody stands on an equal footing in terms of their importance under our system of law and our system of justice. But I'll tell you this, there's very little economic justice today. And we can't have a situation where there's so little economic opportunity and not expect that we're going to have terrible consequences as a result of it.
The time initially yielded by the senator to himself has expired.
I yield myself 5
Senators have, of course, recognized.
We have today in America about 16 million people that we know about that are unemployed and need work. That includes what are called discouraged workers that are so disappointed they've just given up looking, and it includes some people who are working part-time because they can't find full-time work. There was some striking examples in the news just recently. There was a situation where they opened a hotel in the city of Chicago, and they had about 100 jobs to offer, not terribly high-paying jobs. They had some 15,000 people come out and stand in a raging blizzard, a line stretching for blocks to try to apply and get one of those handful of jobs. Or one that was even worse the other night. They interviewed 2 young men who a year ago were wearing the uniform of this country fighting in Desert Storm. Young men that had been asked to go and serve their country and did so with distinction, came back, received parades which they justly deserved, and now a year later are unemployed, can't find a job, and are homeless, living in cardboard boxes. Now, how can we let that be America's story? I want those young men to have a chance to work. They are every bit as important as the sons and daughters of the president, the vice president, every senator, every House member, every cabinet member, or anybody else in this country. And they deserve a decent chance for economic opportunity. And it happens the 2 I speak about are Afro-American. They're black. That makes their situation even tougher in America, as we all know, because there's too much racism in our society. The other day, they asked a group of high school students, white students, in a hypothetical question that if they went to bed one night and woke up the next morning and found they were black in American society, how much money do they think they would have to compensate for the fact that they had been changed from white to black? And the answer was they would need at least $1 million. What are the children saying to us? They understand what's going on. They understand what's going on, and we've got to get past that problem. We've got to reach out to all of our people. And white people particularly have a special obligation and an opportunity and a responsibility of leadership to reach out to people in our society of color. That's part of what it means to be an American, and that's to reach out to every other fellow American. And that's been part of our problem, and it's part of our problem today. We had a young man, quite well known, Blair Underwood, on television in the TV series L.A. Law, came up to testify before the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. He told us a chilling personal story, not unlike Rodney King. One day after filming in his TV program, he was driving back to his very lovely home in the Hollywood Hills area of Los Angeles. And as he was pulling up in front of his own home in a very nice automobile that he owns, a police car came in behind him. And a police officer got out and came up and asked him who he was and what he was doing in that neighborhood. And before he could explain that he was parking his car in front of his own house, the police officer ordered him out of the car, pulled out a gun, made him get on the ground, and threatened him with being shot right on the spot. Why? No question as to why. It was because he was black. And there's no question in my mind, as I stand here today and as I have seen, as many others have so many times, the videotape of the beating of Rodney King, there's no doubt in my mind that the reason that he was hit 59 times in 81 seconds was in large part because he was black. But we've got to get past that in America. And it isn't just the case of those that otherwise would commit violent acts, whether it's those in uniform or in civilian capacities. You can do violent things without engaging in a violent act. Indifference can be violent, have a violent effect. Drawing a line through somebody's name, a bank not giving equal credit access to a black potential borrower is a violent act. And it starts to wreck their economic prospects and wreck their economic future and eventually wreck their faith in this country. So those things have to change. And those of us in positions of leadership have a special obligation to speak to it and to speak out about it and to bring about the change. We've got a program here that we can carry out. I'm for enterprise zones. We're going to have Jack Kemp in tomorrow before the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee to talk about that issue. And we'll have Arthur Fletcher and Jesse Jackson and Jim Rouse as well, all who can bring important perspective to us after we hear from the mayors in the hearing this afternoon. But if the enterprise zone in an inner city area does not employ inner city people, then it doesn't mean very much. If it's just a building with a certain tax advantage that allows somebody to make money in the name of a self-help program that doesn't really provide jobs in the inner city, then it doesn't mean much. We need tax base and we need jobs in the inner cities. And in order to have that, as I'm sure the senator from New York will talk about, you've got to have family structure. And in order to have that, you've got to have the things that allow it to take place. You've got to have access to health care. You've got to have access to education. And you can't be shot to death just walking from your house to church or to a store on the corner as a victim of random violence. But if we can afford $44 billion to build 20 more of these B-2 bombers that we don't need, and which is corporate socialism of the worst kind, then we have the resources that it takes in a material sense to address the problems of our cities. And I don't want one youngster in America, black, brown, yellow, or white, to lose the chance for a future because this country is indifferent or looking the other way or too busy helping some other country or some defense contractor or sending too much money up to the top of the income scale with the outlandish and outrageous tax cuts of the 1980s that favored the wealthiest people of this country. We can do better than that, and we have to do better than that. Our cities are not going to survive. Every city in America today is a powder keg. Make no mistake about it. You could have an event tonight in any major city in America, and if the rumors start that somehow there was police violence or there was something else that happened in that situation, we can have a replay of what happened in Los Angeles. We can't afford to have that happen. We can't afford to have that happen. And we're smarter than that, and God hope we're better than that, and that we're more decent than that, and that we care enough about each other still in the spirit of our founding documents to want to reach out and help where help is needed. So we've got to continue to move. We've got to move the health care plan through the Finance Committee. We've got to move again to continue to end mortgage lending discrimination through the Banking Committee, which we've been doing. We've got to renew these programs in job training. Absolutely vital. If there's not a way to get routed into the job sector of our economy, then there is not going to be any real hope. And when this country turns its back on a large part of its citizens, why is it surprising that the citizens turn around and say the country doesn't matter to me because the country doesn't care about me? Who's setting that example in the first instance? Our government can't walk away from these problems. And if I may, I'm going to yield myself 3 additional minutes, and then I'm going to yield the floor. I want to talk for a minute about the racial problem in America. I want to talk about how it started. It started with slave ships over 400 years ago, and African families that were doing quite nicely. Where they lived were taken captive, put in human bondage, locked in the holds of ships, and brought by the hundreds of thousands over the United States to serve as slaves. If you've ever seen the drawing of a slave ship, in the hold of the ship, they would actually draw an outline on the floorboards of the ship as to where each slave was to go, laying down on the floorboards of the ship so they could get the maximum number of slaves into the ship. In fact, up in the bow of the ship where there's a bend, there would actually be a drawing of somebody who had to be in that curled up position so they could get one more slave in the hold of that ship. And when the slave ships came across the ocean, and they normally came into the Caribbean first, if there were children on board, the children were the first ones off because they were the ones that most often died on these trips. And any children that survived, they took out of the arms of their mothers and their fathers and they dropped them off down in the Caribbean. Then they would come up the southern coast of the United States. And next, most often, they would unload the men. And they were sold off as slaves at that point, and then finally further up the coast, the mothers were dropped off. Imagine anything as savage and as inhumane as that, to take people into human bondage and to pull children right out of their arms of their mothers in that fashion. That's been the history in this country, and that's what it's like to have been black in America, to come from that history and not even be seen as being a human being. Well, we've made some progress since that time, but not enough. Not enough. And we've got to address where this comes from. And those of us in this country who are white in positions of leadership, not just in government, but in business and communities and our churches and wherever, we've got to help break down what's left of this racial division, the racial stereotyping, and we've got to help rescue our cities that are falling apart. There's no investment in infrastructure, no investment in our people, and there's very little hope. And that's got to change. People will do something with their lives if they have a chance. And it's the job of government to see that people in America have a chance. And the people I talk to, that's all they're asking for, is a chance. They're not asking for a guaranteed outcome. When somebody asks for a job, it's for a chance to work. And when we turn our back on somebody that's asking for a job and desperately needs a job, we fail them and we fail America. That's the issue here. So I don't want to just see a few code words for a few days. I want to see the president invested in this in a serious way. He's got the capacity to do that. I know this man. And if he decides to focus on this issue and put his energy into it, things will happen. I ask him to do that. I'll help him do it. I'll help him do it as chairman of the Senate Housing, Banking, and Urban Affairs Committee. But it's got to be done, and we can't wait any longer because we're losing part of America every single day. And it's not right. It's just not right. We don't have to settle for that. Other nations are not settling for that. They're investing in their people. They're putting together strategies to help people lift themselves up to a higher and higher level. We've got to do that here in America. That's the task that's before us. We can't wait any longer. I don't want to lose one more black child or white child in America to a violent act. Let's protect our children. Let's help them have a decent chance to live, and not in a cardboard box after they come back from fighting in Desert Storm and can't find a job. We can do better than that in America. So I ask the administration to make the commitment to do something that's serious about it and repudiate whoever this spokesman was that John Apple was talking about yesterday. And by the way, the writer of this article would do us a favor if he identified who this person is. I'd like to know who it is so they can be run out of the government or run out of that campaign because it's shameful thinking. Mr. President, I reserve the balance of my time.
The Senator reserves the balance of his time. The Senator from New York. By the